what kind of actions do you think should be considered a crime?
Well, first of all, I think that, let me just talk about crime as a whole. There are no easy solutions to very difficult and complicated problems, and crime is certainly one of them. And nobody has a magic wand that they can wave that will have the perfect solution to dealing with crime or getting rid of crime. But I think as a society, we have to try to work toward making our communities crime-free, or as close to being crime-free as we can, and to try to come up with some solutions. I'm from the school that says that government does have a role to play in these types of problems, and I think government can play a very positive role. To answer your question about what constitutes a crime, I would think that anything that adversely affects the well-being of other people or of society as a whole could be constituted as a crime. Certainly if you mug somebody or harm somebody in any way, or harm society in any way, I think that you have committed a crime. You're infringing on the personal well-being of another individual or of society in general. So I think that is probably what we would constitute as a crime.
Could you reduce it to a principle that would permit us to distinguish those actions that should be considered a crime from those that should not? Because the concept harm could be interpreted in different ways, and you were saying that there were certain harms to society that didn't involve harm to the individual. Could you state it in the form of a principle so we could be able to see clearly?
Well, when you talk about crimes, of course, there are different aspects of crimes, a different degree of crimes. There's certainly violent crime, which is what we think about the most when we think about safety in the community. Any kind of violent crime, I think people know what that means, is certainly constitutes a crime. And then there are all kinds of other crimes, what some people might call white-collar crimes, different dishonest things that people do. I think that anything that deviates from what's generally accepted in terms of society, and again, those standards are different for different people, but society has different laws which are passed by different legislative bodies telling what specifically constitutes a crime in all 50 states and the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico and other places constituting the United States territories. And we have, of course, the federal code, which delineates on the federal level what constitutes a crime. What might be considered a crime in one state, for instance, might not be a crime in another state. But if we're talking about violent crime, then I think it's pretty easy to understand what constitutes a violent crime. And if you harm another person physically, that is a crime in all states, and a federal crime as well.
So you think that there are some actions that should be considered a crime, and at the same time they should not, because one jurisdiction makes it illegal and the other not? You think that the fact that a legislator or legislature passes a law that to make something illegal means that it should be considered a crime?
Well, I don't know if it should be considered a crime. I'm just speaking legally in terms of our
code.
If you violate one of the statutes of the state or of the federal government, you have, according to the law, committed a crime. Now, each of us as individuals may think that some crimes are permissible. For instance, when we had involvement in this country for many years in the civil rights struggle and the civil rights movements, there were many so-called nonviolent activities which technically constituted a crime in the states in which they were committed. But for the higher purpose, for the higher moral purpose of achieving civil rights and integration and things that now are looked upon generally favorable in our society, they were necessary to do. Non-violent crimes. Technically, though, those people committed crimes. We may not think that it was a crime, and we may have sympathy with what they did, but according to the statutes of those states, it was a crime. So what I'm trying to say is that we have what each individual may or may not think is a crime, and then we have the statutes, which are the laws, which constitute legally what is the definition of a crime.
Yeah, I was not asking you what is a crime in the sense that what is on the books. We know if it's a law and you violate it, that's a crime. What I was asking you was what action should be considered a crime. Your personal view, do you have a principle that permits us to distinguish those actions that should be considered a crime from those that should not? So precisely we could evaluate legislation, either proposed or already on the books, and say, this should not be a crime because it doesn't conform to this principle.
I don't have any hard and fast principles about what should be a crime and what shouldn't be a crime.
I see.
I just try to deal with safety, because I think that's very, very important. And I think that lots of things are decided on a case-by-case basis.
Well,
but I don't have any general principles. I just think that we need to get a grip on safety in this country, because when you poll Americans and you ask them what are their major concerns, crime always comes up number one. And when people are talking about crime, generally they're thinking about violent crime. They're thinking about safety. They're thinking about their general welfare. People don't want to obviously walk outside and get mugged and have their pocketbook taken from them or their wallet stolen. People don't want to see someone break into their home and assault them or steal their property.
I agree. So if you don't have a principle, how do you know which actions should be prohibited and which should not?
Well, I don't think it's up for me personally to decide. Again, I think there are laws that are passed.
So don't you have to vote, and you're a legislator and you have to make these decisions? Wouldn't it be useful for you to have a principle that permitted you to differentiate those actions that should be considered a crime from those that should not?
No, there are violent crimes that are committed, and I think that violent crimes are certainly crimes, and I think we need to take measures to make sure that our society is safer, but I don't think there are any general principles about what constitutes a crime and what doesn't constitute a crime.
Well, can you evaluate effectively if you don't have a principle?
Well, because I don't think it's a semantical, we're talking about semantics here. I don't think that crime is a semantical discussion. I think people know, generally speaking, when a crime has been committed, when they feel a crime has been committed, and that is for the justice system to play out, that is for juries to decide, that is for judges to decide. We write the laws trying to protect people's safety, but we don't decide individual cases. That's not our role as legislators. Our role as legislators is to make the law and have the judiciary decide cases on a case-by-case basis.
Are you saying that we know automatically what should be a crime and what should not be a crime?
Do we know automatically?
Yeah.
No, I think that's for juries to decide. I think that's why we have the system that we have of American jurisprudence. We have a system of indictments where someone's formally charged with a crime, and the grand jury sits and decides who will be formally charged, and then we have a regular jury of peers deciding whether or not the person's guilty.
But you were saying that we don't need a principle, that we can evaluate effectively without a principle?
No, the principles are what you or I as individuals think ought to be principles isn't what governs our laws. What governs our laws, obviously, are what's on the books. What's on the books is interpreted by the prosecutors and by people obviously charging people with crimes, and then the jury decides whether or not the people have committed the crime.
Right, you have to make a judgment, though, don't you, as a citizen and as a legislator, whether a particular proposed legislation should be considered a crime or should not. So don't you need a principle to make that evaluation?
There are different laws that are on the books in terms of a whole multitude of different crimes. Again, some are violent crimes, some are non-violent crimes, some are what's called white-collar crimes, blue-collar crimes. They're all different kinds of crimes. And so what we do with each thing that comes up in terms of how the law ought to be set is we evaluate it on a basis of each situation, not a basis of any kind of set principles or individual cases. For instance,
can you evaluate in the individual cases without having a principle? Is it possible to evaluate without having a principle?
I'm not. I don't fully understand, what you're trying to get at.
Well, what is an evaluation if it isn't the use of a
The
major
role-
principle applied to a specific concrete?